The community had all but ground to a halt in the blink of an eye. The Theater of Blood, a most notorious venture until the cheat client Nuke had finally come to a rest. Seasoned veterans scattered to the wind after a single update to put a stop to dubious intentions. For those like me, a max effer, this signaled the end of an era. Like our predecessors from discontinued games, we too would become obsolete. Pity, because I lived for it. Defeat, it seemed, had us in its grasp. Nearly 6 months have passed since that night, yet our dubious intentions proved unwilling to follow cheat clients to the grave. Though we were fewer in number, the scheme itself had become more perilous, for their update no longer held its sway. Older, more skilled adventurers were now able to manipulate the maze. Over time, already efficient strategies were reconstructed and optimized. The methods had evolved, but our goal remained the same. Beat them all, one by one.
Oh, Nuki! Hello? Hello? What? Oh, bro. That's so tragic.
Good morning, what's going on, guys? I hope you all liked that intro, and welcome to the start of Road to Wreck Season 2. Before we start, I want to let you guys know that from the moment this video releases, I'll be streaming our runs on Twitch, so if you're into watching us live, be sure to check it out. Okay, I'm really excited to start this season because we made a lot of progress. As the intro foreshadowed, our methods have changed slightly, and I'll talk about that more as we go, but first, allow me to paint a picture of what happened during the past couple of months. There's been somewhat of a radio silence regarding the series, and I can't say Season 1 ended on a banger because it was never meant to be the last episode. However, things didn't go as planned and we had to adjust. Meet Desperados. Some of you might have already heard of him because he's a prestiged endgame PVMer, and not just a top bot like myself. Now obviously, when going for wrecks, especially ones that have stood for over a year, the bar is pretty high. Though he had experience with max efficiency money rates and used to speedrun 5s, he needed to catch up with the current meta. That included learning the Sotetseg and general ultra efficiency teamwork plays, so to speak. As to why we took so long, well, Desp wasn't our first and only trialist. Okay, so now that's out of the way, I want to continue the episode on a lighter note, but a heavier tone. This season I want to make episodes based on our funny and or hype moments, as well as show full runs if they were any good. But in order to help everyone understand what the perfect raid would look like, I'm going to show a close to perfect example for each room in this episode as a proper introduction, giving this season the structure I feel was lacking during Season 1. I'll also make a new chart to keep track of our resetting thresholds and help you see how and why this is what we're running. After we make the chart, I'll compare it to current wrecks so you can see that these thresholds make sense. Keep in mind that these rooms won't be from the same raid, otherwise I'd be making a whole different video. Let's get into Maiden, one of the more intense bosses. So we recently got the Maiden room wreck, a 103. I guess you could say this is as good of an example as there will ever be. Before we entered, the mages got booked and regen back up to 95 spec and nearly to 100. This way they can double BGS on entry if needed, but if not, with Lightbearer, they will regen a ZCB spec to push for 30s, as you'll see in just a minute. We enter DD'd to cause as few blood splats as possible, reducing the odds of a blood spawn. This doesn't help with DPS, but can help avoid sketchy situations. Then, we get it to 0 defense, and both mages can save to regen for that ZCB spec. If we didn't insta-zero her, one or both mages back up, depending on defense, losing some of our 30s pushing potential. Next, we get a 16-second 70s proc. These are pretty rare because you need crazy good DPS at the start to already proc 70s here, and it usually takes 1, sometimes 2 or more bows to proc 70s. North freezes all, while South freezes 1-2, and as North freezes 4s, the Ranger ZCB specs Maiden to make sure the 50s proc immediately. This way, North can continue freezing 1, 2, 3, 4 50s directly after freezing the 4s from 70s. and this had been part of our method since before TOA. What changed is what comes in next. The mages are about to regen their ZCB spec, and depending on Maiden's health, they will do either one more T-bow after fours get frozen, or sometimes ZCB right away if she's already low enough to force the 30s proc. Everything on this Maiden was perfect, and after every segment, we maintained high DPS, which is how this turned into wreck. During most Maidens, only some of these things occur, causing those Maidens to be slower, but still good enough to be considered pace. We haven't quite decided yet, but our threshold will be either 115 or 116.8, and maybe we'll just let it depend on how we're feeling that day. That brings us to Bloat. Bloat's pretty simple. We want a 1-down and ideally a fast one. Sometimes Bloat walks longer than other times, and this, along with our DPS, makes the difference for the Bloat room time. On entry, the P-neckers BGS Bloat to 0 defense. The less specs they need, the more claws we have to ensure the 1-down. Obviously, the P-necker should try to be tick perfect while not dying to flies or hands and stay around the corner from each other so the flies don't bounce and deal double damage. In the meantime, the AFKers, as I like to call them, should be ready to enter the very tick Bloat goes down while not entering too early. Because we need 20 P-necks for Sot, we don't have enough space to go 3 in, and this basically means we'll settle for any Bloat that puts us at a sub 2 into Nylo. This means it'll largely depend on our Maiden whether the Bloat is runnable. We don't often have to reset after Bloat because with our Maiden thresholds, it's very unlikely that when we get the 1-down, it's so bad that we're not at sub 2 pace. Right, so for Nylo waves, we're pretty much aiming for a 252, 250, or 248 boss spawn. Anything slower is generally caused by either really bad RNG, but more likely some kind of trolling. The wave time is very much in our control within that 248 to 252 range, and we spent a lot of time optimizing this and molding DESP to exactly how this team does waves. At the start of the boss, one person will BGS until 0 defense, and 4 people will have gold booked mid-waves so they can chally and then ZCB as soon as it turns range. The best boss rotation, which we call a gold boss, is melee and range only. This is statistically pretty rare at 1 in 32, assuming a 6-phase boss, and most of the time the raid is still runnable with 1 or sometimes even 2 mage phases. The opposite of a gold boss would be a mage phase every other phase, and this is unfortunately statistically much more likely than a gold boss, but feels pretty bad every time it happens anyway. These are called Harry Potter bosses and are often the cause of a reset. For now, our threshold will be low 530s into Sot, and I'll put that on the chart. Next up is Sot, and this room is pretty much the core of speedrunning TOB right now. Without the maze stalling method, there would be near to no competing at all. It's very intense, and I won't go over all the details, but the main takeaway is that we want to hit at least 2 Warhammer specs each phase, and we all want to survive both mazes. There are many technicalities, and we do loads of small efficiency plays like using group heal after you're chosen so that the team who would otherwise come off the maze with about 40 health gets put to above 50 and can therefore take revenge during that phase without getting one shot. Another example is that after each maze, we split up in a very specific way, almost choreographed, to help everybody see exactly where the orbs are bouncing to while we split up. I could keep going, but I think you get the point. This room is both gatekeeper and full of potential, as every time we run it, we could crush room wreck by a large margin if we get similar RNG as the Sot room wreck pre-client nuke. However, due to its nature, it's also the most inconsistent room. Before the Maiden change, we used to run 705 into Xarpus, and for now we've chosen to stick with that time so that we get more attempts. If it turns out we get too many runs because Maiden has become more consistent and start to run out of daily Mage Cape swaps, we'll lower the threshold as we go. 705 was good enough pace to wreck on, and still is, especially because we have another improvement up our sleeve that I'll get into soon. But first, let's talk about Xarpus. During Xarpus, we're just super coordinated to stop the heals, nothing special. 3 people got booked to regen a ZCB spec just before Xarp dies. We get him to 0 defense, yada yada yada. We've all seen Xarpus a million times before. It's just tick perfect and usually dies to hit after our CCBs, or a hit later with bad damage. If it's any slower, something must have gone horribly wrong, like terrible specs or low-skilled deaths. At this point, we don't really reset because it's always good to practice and refresh our memory on Verzik, and you'll see why shortly. Finally, we get to the 3-phase room, which I'll discuss as 3 separate bosses. For P1, we have this, perhaps the some, intimidating sheet. This is new. Put your lab coats and goggles on for a second. For those who haven't seen a sheet like this before, let me explain how to read it. Each player is assigned a number on the sheet. They will follow that row's attacking order. Each column is 1 tick, so 2 scythe hits must be 5 ticks apart. Each player will read their row, memorize it, and perform it regardless of what happens. Nothing can go wrong, or everything goes wrong. We made this to improve the old sheet, which looks fairly similar, but after closer inspection turned out to be unnecessarily flawed. We had been using the old sheet for ages, and because it was given and taught to us this way, I never really considered whether it made sense. The difference between the sheets isn't massive. However, upon improving the sheet by a few ticks, I stumbled onto a secondary ingredient. I figured we could optimize our spec regen if we equipped the Lightbearer ring during P1, and I wondered how much value that might add. As it turns out, instead of having 1 claw and 4 challies for the first P2 red crab phase, we can regen enough for 4 claw specs and 2 challies for the first red phase. This is massive because in 5s it's often pretty close to a 1-down, but not quite there. We've already had several 1-downs during testing, while we hadn't had a single one during any of the episodes of Season 1. Yes, it's a small sample size, but it does make a lot of sense, and we've already got some data to back it up. Alright, enough math, but keep the lab coats on for P2. After P1, we quickly get ready for P2, and this is where part 2 of the plan starts. After P1,
2,000 years later.
Okay guys, I realized after editing that I spent 4 minutes explaining how we got 3 extra claws, and however interesting that is to me, I'm gonna leave this one out of the video. Long story short, just believe me. I'll put the omitted script in the description. This is where we can remove our lab coats though, as we finally made it to P3 Verzik. P3 is pretty straightforward. We have a similar crab popping technique, and simply pray for good DPS. We can optimize our venges to triple venge before webs, but that's old news and I won't explain in detail. Once P3 starts, it's really the final stretch, and we simply need to finish the raid while maintaining the nervous shakes. Now you may think I forgot to fill in the chart after Xarpus, but I really wanted to discuss what kind of entry we need for rec. So let's take a look at current rec. Current rec is 1219.2 and is held by 4 crazy good gamers and 1 leech. So, if we then consider what a good but not impossible Verzik looks like, I'd say we can run anything that would require a 310 or better Verzik, because that fits the bill perfectly. Really good, but not impossible. Particularly not impossible if we do get a 1-down reds. So, if we backtrack, anything under 910 after Xarpus would be considered pace. The odds of all of this lining up are actually pretty good. Much better than the odds of current rec, which at the time was so insane that it made all of the competition basically quit the game or at least retire from speedrunning TOB. Speaking of current rec, let's see how that holds up to our chart. Our Maiden threshold is slightly slower than the rec run. We can get away with this because there is plenty of time to be saved in later rooms such as Nylos, Sotetseg, and Verzik. Additionally, there is a very high chance we get better Maidens regularly, so this threshold is more or less for show. You'll see that this trend continues, and the reason we're using these just over rec pace thresholds is that if we get one really good room, or room rec for example, we'll be in good shape. Seeing many rooms makes the team more experienced and warmed up whenever we do get a good run, so we're playing to see lots of good runs and eventually get that one run with room rec or close to it. This is what we can see happened in our hypothetical current run, which was compiled from some of the better rooms of several different runs. I mentioned in Season 1 that I view overall rec sort of as a rare drop. We need good RNG to line up, and when it does, we need to capitalize. To close it off, I'm really glad I laid the foundation for all of you guys to better understand what's going on, so the clips in the following episodes will make more sense. I hope you had a good time, and as always, thanks for watching.